Trucks backed to the edge of the water, a conveyor belt running, and shells, thousands of them, cascading off the end and splashing into the murky green Gulf of Florida. These were not engineering materials, they were kitchen scraps. Oyster shells collected from restaurant bins, dried in the sun for months, loaded onto barges, and dumped offshore in the exact spots where reefs used to exist. 500,000 tons of them, over years of programs that sounded, to most people watching, like the world's most expensive form of littering. But what grew from those shells was not what anyone planned for, and it turned out to be the one thing this coastline had been quietly dying without. To understand why this mattered, you have to first understand what the water looked like. Stand on a dock almost anywhere along Florida's Gulf Coast, and you see green-brown water stretching out toward what looks like featureless mudflat. Pelicans on a piling, a flat horizon, maybe a boat moving slowly through shallow water above a bottom that shows nothing, no structure, no shadow, no reef profile, just sand and sediment. That image feels natural. It feels like what coastal Florida is supposed to look like. It is not. That water, that turbidity, that emptiness, that is evidence. It is what the coast looks like when a system that used to clean it has been stripped out. And almost nobody alive today ever saw what this coastline looked like before that stripping began. Historical survey records, early navigation charts, and accounts from the 1800s describe oyster reefs in Florida's coastal bays that were genuine obstacles to boat traffic. Reefs that ran for miles, structures that rose high enough to break the surface at low tide. Apalachicola Bay on the Florida Panhandle, which sits at the mouth of the Apalachicola River, was once considered one of the most productive wild oyster fisheries in the entire United States. For generations, oystering was not just an industry there. It was the identity of the town, the work of families who had done it their whole lives, a culture built around shallow water boats and tong handles and the specific knowledge of where the reefs ran. By 2012, the state of Florida closed the commercial oyster harvest in Apalachicola Bay entirely. Not reduced it, closed it. The reefs had collapsed so severely that there was nothing left to sustainably harvest. Now, that collapse had a complicated set of causes. Drought years reduced freshwater flow from the Apalachicola River, which pushed salinity up in the bay and stressed the oysters. An ongoing legal fight between Florida, Georgia, and Alabama over water rights in the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint River Basin had been draining the river's upper watershed for decades, reducing the pulse of fresh water that the bay depended on. Disease, specifically the parasitic infections known as dermo and MSX, had been hammering oyster populations throughout the Gulf and Atlantic coast. And the water quality in the bay had been deteriorating under pressure from development, agricultural runoff, and the sediment disturbance that came with commercial harvesting itself. The state responded by negotiating over freshwater flows, by funding disease research, by studying water quality, by doing all of the things that seemed logically connected to the visible problems. None of it reversed the trajectory. The fishery kept declining. The oystermen of Apalachicola watched years of meetings and programs, and spending produced no meaningful change on the water. The reefs did not come back. Here is the part that everyone missed. The problem with Apalachicola Bay was not only water quality, it was not only disease or freshwater or salinity. Those were real problems. But underneath all of them was a structural failure that had been building for over a century and that none of those programs were designed to fix. When commercial oyster harvesting operated at full industrial scale, it did not only remove oysters, it removed the shells. The physical structure of the reef itself was being extracted from the bay and never returned. Historically, harvesters had dredged shell from the bottom, not just as a byproduct, but deliberately, to sell as road fill, as poultry grit, as building aggregate. The shells themselves had commercial value separate from the meat, so the reef was being dismantled from both directions, animals taken for food, shells taken for construction, and what was left behind was increasingly flat, structureless bottom. That does not sound catastrophic until you understand what oyster larvae actually need. An oyster does not start as a reef. It starts as a nearly microscopic free-floating larva, spawned into the water column, drifting with the current for roughly 2 to 3 weeks. During that time, it is searching. It is chemically detecting its environment, looking for one specific signal: the biofilm of bacteria that colonizes the surface of old oyster shell. That biofilm is not random. It is a cue. Larvae are drawn to it because the presence of old shell with that specific bacterial coating signals that this is a place where oysters have successfully grown before. It is, in biological terms, confirmation that the conditions here are survivable. When larvae find that signal, they settle. They attach permanently to the hard substrate and begin building a shell of their own. That shell becomes substrate for the next generation, and the next. Each generation of oysters builds on the physical legacy of the one before. That is how a reef grows. Not by any individual oyster, but by compounding layers of shells over time, each generation creating the conditions that allow the next one to land. Take away the shell and you break that chain completely. This is the trap. You cannot rebuild an oyster reef without oyster shell to settle on, but you cannot get oyster shell without an oyster reef. The larvae were still there. Remnant adult populations were still spawning. The water column was still carrying billions of larvae through the bay every season. They had nowhere to land. They settled on soft mud and died, or drifted past and were lost. The reef could not rebuild itself because the raw material it depended on had been hauled away and never replaced. That is why the freshwater negotiations did not fix the reefs. That is why the disease research did not fix the reefs. They were fighting the right battles in the wrong order. The foundation was gone. You cannot address a building's plumbing before you have rebuilt its floor. There had been earlier attempts to address this. Small-scale shell recycling and deployment programs appeared in Florida and other Gulf Coast states as far back as the 1980s and the 1990s. Researchers and fishery managers had understood, in principle, that substrate return was important, but the results were inconsistent. Some sites showed strong settlement, others showed almost nothing. Artificial alternatives, concrete modules, and limestone rock attracted some marine life but produced lower oyster settlement rates than natural shell. The inconsistency was frustrating, and it gave skeptics a reasonable argument. If this was the answer, why didn't it work? The answer was placement. Shell dumped in the wrong location, too deep, in low salinity water, far from remnant adult populations, in areas with unstable soft bottom, was just dead shell. It did not help because the larvae that needed it were not concentrated there. Researchers at Florida State University and elsewhere began studying what separated the sites that worked from the ones that didn't. The conclusions pointed to a specific combination of factors. The shell had to be placed within reach of existing adult populations that could supply larvae at depths where larvae tended to concentrate, in areas with enough current to carry the larvae to the substrate, and in layers thick enough to stay stable on the bottom rather than sinking into the sediment. The early programs had been putting shell in the water. The refined programs put shell in the right water. That distinction made the difference. Once deployment strategies were targeted correctly, the results changed. Shell substrate in well-placed restoration sites began showing settlement rates dramatically higher than bare bottom control sites in the same waterways. Within 1 to 2 growing seasons, monitoring teams were measuring visible reef structure where there had been flat bottom before. That is not a long time. That is 1 to 2 trips back to the same GPS coordinate and finding something physical where nothing had been. Fish began aggregating over the new structure. Redfish, sheep's head, black drum, speckled trout, species that use three-dimensional reef habitat for shelter, feeding, and spawning. Wading birds appeared at reef edges to feed. Blue crabs moved into the shell matrix. The reef was not just a pile of shells producing oysters. It was becoming an address, a neighborhood, a place where dozens of species could live. And the water above the reef was changing. A single adult oyster filters roughly 50 gallons of water per day. That is the individual. A functioning reef, thousands of animals stacked across acres of bottom, is a filtration system operating continuously, pulling particles out of the water column, clearing the turbidity, letting light through. When the reefs had been stripped, the filter was gone. The murk moved in and stayed. That murk was not just unpleasant to look at, it was ecologically catastrophic. Seagrasses, the underwater meadows that serve as nursery habitat for juvenile fish, as feeding grounds for sea turtles, as carbon-storing root systems, need sunlight to photosynthesize. Turbid water blocks light. Where the reefs had disappeared, the seagrass had followed them. And where the seagrass went, the juvenile fish went. And where the juvenile fish went, the commercial fish populations followed. In restoration zones where oyster reefs were re-establishing, monitoring began recording measurably clearer water above the active reef structure. In some sites, seagrass was returning to areas where it had been absent for years. The reef was not just growing oysters, it was cleaning the water, and the cleaned water was growing seagrass, and the seagrass was growing fish. The system was cascading outward from a pile of old shells. The oystermen of Apalachicola had lived through every phase of this collapse. They had been skeptical of restoration programs for good reason. They had watched programs come and go while the water got worse. But what restoration workers and researchers began describing, reef structure returning faster than expected, fish species showing up over the new sites, water quality changing above active reefs, matched something the older fishermen could remember, not from science. From their own time on the water, years before the collapse, when they had known without instruments which areas of the bay held productive reefs because those areas looked and smelled and moved differently. The water had been different over the reefs. It still was where the reefs were coming back. Here is where the story gets larger than anyone had planned. Oyster reefs do something beyond filtering water and producing shellfish. At the right position along a shoreline, between open water and marsh edge, they reduce wave energy. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but measurably. The three-dimensional structure of a reef interrupts incoming waves, dissipating energy before it reaches the marsh grass behind it. Projects along Florida's Gulf Coast that incorporated oyster reef structures as living shorelines, as biological alternatives to rock or concrete seawalls, began documenting lower erosion rates on the adjacent marsh compared to unprotected shorelines. The reef was not just a fishery, it was coastal armor. It was protecting the marsh behind it, and the marsh was returning the favor by providing the sheltered water and sediment stability that the reef needed to hold. Nobody had sold the shell recycling program as coastal erosion control. It came as an extra. The shells were dumped to give larvae somewhere to land. Everything else, the fish, the water clarity, the seagrass, the marsh protection, was the reef doing what a functioning reef had always done, which is to say, more than one thing at once. Similar programs now operate across the Gulf Coast and up through the Atlantic states. Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina are all running documented shell recycling and culture deployment programs, collecting shells from restaurants and seafood processors, curing them, deploying them in identified restoration zones. The Chesapeake Bay program is one of the most studied in the country, with long-term monitoring data showing consistent settlement advantages on shell substrate versus alternative materials. The mechanism is the same everywhere. Larvae need somewhere to land. Shell is what they recognize. Return the shell, and the loop can restart. This does not work everywhere. It is important to say that clearly. Apalachicola Bay still faces real challenges. The freshwater flow dispute with Georgia and Alabama is not resolved. Disease pressure on oyster populations across the Gulf has not disappeared. Climate-driven changes in water temperature and salinity create stress that targeted substrate restoration cannot fully counteract. The shell program works best where a remnant adult population still exists, still spawning, still supplying larvae that have somewhere to go if the substrate appears. Where no adults remain at all, there are no larvae to settle, and the shell sits empty. The loop requires at least a thread of the old system to still be running. It cannot restart from zero, but in the places where conditions allow it, what the shells are enabling is not a human construction. It is a resumption. The reef knows what to do. The larvae know what to land on. The fish know where to shelter. The birds know where to feed. None of that knowledge went anywhere. It was just waiting for a surface to return. Stand at the water's edge on Florida's Gulf Coast today, over one of the active restoration zones, and you are looking at water that is slightly clearer than the water beside it. There is structure on the bottom you can see from above on a calm day, a shadow where there used to be nothing. Fish move around that shadow. Birds work the edge of it. Old accounts describe reefs here that were hazards to navigation, that ran for miles, that broke the surface at low tide. That Florida is not coming back in one generation. The damage went too deep and lasted too long for any shell program to undo it entirely in years. But the larvae are settling, the reefs are building, the water above them is cleaner. The seagrass is returning in patches, the fish are using the structure. The marsh beside the living shorelines is eroding more slowly. Florida did not build a new reef. It returned the raw material the reef had always needed to build itself. The animal was never gone. It just had nowhere to land. There are more stories like this, places where the answer that looked too small, too cheap, or too strange turned out to be the missing piece that the system had been waiting for. If this one surprised you, the next one will too.